Too much independence is not always strength, sometimes it is survival. Not every wound makes noise. Some grow up quietly, disguised as precocious maturity, excessive independence, and an eerie sense of never feeling completely at home neither in relationships nor within themselves. Many people have spent their entire lives believing that they were strong, when in fact they only learned too early not to need anyone. And this detail changes everything when we talk about attachment, emotional abandonment, and self-worth. Maybe you're that person who loves too much, but is suspicious when you receive love. Or that works well on the outside, but lives on the alert inside, as if something could always go wrong. Psychology shows that growing up without love doesn't just create difficult memories, it creates a nervous system shaped to survive, not to feel secure. And that's where hypervigilance, self-sabotage, and false self-sufficiency come in, which seem like strength but are costly. In this content, we will reveal what almost no one explains: why the absence of love can be an invisible trauma, how it shapes your choices, your bonds, and even your identity, and, above all, how it is possible to rewrite this history. Not to blame the past, but to finally get out of survival mode and build real, deep, and possible emotional healing. Because understanding your story isn't about victimizing yourself, it's about regaining control of it. There are people who enter an environment almost asking permission to breathe. They apologize for existing, speak too softly, shrink emotionally, and try to take up less space in the world. This behavior is not born out of nowhere. It usually springs from stories marked by unstable attachment, emotional abandonment, and a constant sense of rejection. On the outside, they look polite. Inside, they carry an invisible trauma that has never been named. This pattern appears in small but repeated gestures: avoiding asking for help, minimizing pain, laughing when something hurts. It is the inner child who learned early that love came with cost, silence, or condition. Emotional neglect teaches that feeling too much is dangerous, so the body creates self-sufficiency strategies to survive. And, without realizing it, the person starts to measure their self-worth by how much it bothers them or by how much they manage not to bother. Over time, this way of existing becomes identity. Hypervigilance makes the person read expressions, tones, and silences as if they were always about to lose something. Self-regulation becomes a challenge because the nervous system has learned to live in alert, not safety. And so, while it seems functional, it gradually self-erases, without noticing that this adaptation was once necessary, but maybe it is no longer. Not every trauma has a scream, slap, or explicit scene. Sometimes he lives in prolonged silence, in emotionally cold homes, where no one asks how you are doing, and if he does, he doesn't wait for the answer. This type of emotional abandonment usually goes unnoticed because nothing wrong happened, but the body registers everything. Emotional neglect teaches early on that feeling is useless, and attachment is organized around lack, not presence. Growing up like this shapes a dangerous internal logic: if no one welcomes me, it is because there is nothing in me that deserves care. This message is incorporated in a subtle way, affecting self-worth and the way a person positions himself in the world. She may even seem independent, functional, productive, but, inside, she lives in a constant expectation of rejection. It is the invisible trauma acting without leaving obvious marks. The most curious thing is that, because there is no dramatic story, many invalidate their own pain. Others suffered more: it wasn't so serious, I should handle it alone. This early self-sufficiency becomes the rule, not choice. And while the rational mind tries to minimize it, the nervous system continues to react as if it had learned that love is something distant, rare, or unstable, setting the stage for even deeper beliefs that form way back in childhood. When love is lacking, the child does not think my caregivers did not know how to love. She thinks the problem is me. This is the childish logic trying to survive emotional abandonment and emotional neglect. Gradually, a silent and deep belief is installed: I do not deserve care, warmth, or attention. It is not a conscious thought, it is a feeling that seeps into the body and shapes attachment. This message becomes an internal script that accompanies the person in adult life. She accepts less than she deserves, adapts too much, and blames herself when something doesn't work out. Rejection becomes expected, almost familiar, and self-worth is always conditioned by performance or utility. Self-sabotage is common. When something good appears, the mind finds a way to spoil it, as if love were too dangerous to last. The most painful thing is that this belief does not sound like criticism, but like realism. The person says, I'm just like that, I can't demand much, I don't want to bother. The nervous system, trained to survive, confuses safety with distance. And without realizing it, she continues to reproduce the same absence she experienced now with herself, preparing the ground to understand how these marks are registered not only in the mind, but also in the emotional memory of the body. Attachment theory explains something essential: we do not learn to love with words, but with repeated experiences. The nervous system records who was present, who welcomed, who responded, and who was absent. When there is emotional abandonment or emotional neglect, the body learns that connection comes with tension, not rest. Attachment ceases to be secure and becomes vigilant. This shows up in adulthood in subtle and powerful ways. Some people approach already expecting rejection, others keep their distance so as not to feel pain. Hypervigilance enters the scene, reading microexpressions, silences, and changes in tone as danger signals. It's not drama, it's body memory. Invisible trauma lives more in the body than in conscious memory. The good news, and it's really good, is that attachment is not a lifelong sentence. The brain is plastic, and the nervous system can relearn. With self-regulation practices, consistent relationships, and secure experiences, it is possible to build the so-called secure attachment conquered. It doesn't happen overnight, but it starts the moment the person realizes the problem was never being too much, but having received too little. For those who grew up without consistent love, affection can sound like a threat. When someone gets too close, the body reacts: tension, distrust, the desire to run away. Self-sabotage comes in as a learned protection mechanism in emotional abandonment. It is the famous flinching in the face of affection, waiting for rejection before it happens, or testing the other to see how far he can stand. These tests are rarely conscious. The person creates unnecessary conflicts, closes himself off out of nowhere, or assumes that love is a mistake about to be corrected. Hypervigilance turns small signals into big alerts, and the nervous system reacts as if it were reliving the invisible trauma. Loving becomes too dangerous, and loneliness, paradoxically, safer. The key point here is to understand that this is not a character defect, it is a survival strategy. The child who could not trust learned to control the bond by distance. But that same strategy that protected you back then now prevents emotional healing. Recognizing these patterns without guilt is the first step to dismantling them and making room for a different way of relating, which will be explored in the next point. The phrase "I don't need anyone" usually sounds strong, almost admirable. But in many cases, it is born of emotional abandonment, not freedom. Self-sufficiency becomes armor when depending on someone else has been too dangerous. The child learns early that asking for support generates frustration, so he grows up believing that feeling less is the safest way. In adult life, this exaggerated independence disguises itself as maturity. The person solves everything alone, does not ask for help, does not share pain, and is still proud of it. But underneath, there is a tired nervous system, in a constant state of alert, trying to prove its self-worth by performance. Rejection ceases to come from outside and becomes self-imposed. The problem is not being independent, it is confusing independence with emotional isolation. When self-sufficiency prevents the bond, it stops protecting and begins to sabotage. Emotional healing begins when the person realizes that support is not weakness, it is a basic human need. And this recognition makes room for something even deeper, understanding why the body never completely relaxes around others. Those who grew up in unpredictable environments learn to read the world as if it were a minefield. A different sigh, a prolonged silence, a change of mood, everything becomes a warning sign. Hypervigilance is not an exaggeration, it is a skill developed in childhood to avoid emotional abandonment and rejection. The body learns to anticipate danger before it happens. This constant state of observation is tiring, but also addictive. The person becomes extremely perceptive, empathetic, and sensitive to others, often at their own expense. Self-regulation is compromised because the nervous system almost never shuts down. Even in secure relationships, the invisible trauma whispers, "Be aware, something could go wrong." Over time, this surveillance becomes identity, and just like that, very observant. But the price is high: chronic anxiety, difficulty relaxing, and feeling like you're never truly home. Emotional healing is not about ignoring this ability, but about teaching the body that there is now more security than threat. And this leads us to understand what actually happens in the brain of those who have lived like this for so long. The infant brain molds itself from the environment. When there is emotional abandonment and emotional neglect, the nervous system grows into a state of chronic stress. Areas linked to survival become hyperactive, while circuits of calm and safety receive less stimulation. The body learns early on that the world is unpredictable and starts to function waiting for rejection. In adult life, this appears as difficulty in emotional self-regulation. Small conflicts seem like big threats, criticism sounds like personal attacks, and rest is always accompanied by guilt. It's not a lack of willpower, it's neurobiology. Invisible trauma leaves real marks, even when no one has ever called it trauma. The good news is that the brain is not static. Simple and consistent practices help to reprogram these patterns: predictable routines, conscious breathing, therapeutic writing, and even readings that help to name one's own story, such as The Body Keeps the Marks, by Bessel van der Kolk. Every little safe experience sends the nervous system the message that there is now choice, not just survival. There is a curious paradox: those who grew up without love usually become deeply loving adults. They are empathetic people, caregivers, attentive to the pain of others. Precisely because they have known the lack, they develop a rare sensitivity. The problem is that this love is almost always accompanied by self-abandonment and low self-worth. These adults give what they never received, but they often expect little in return. The rejection of others hurts, but the internal rejection itself hurts even more. Self-sabotage appears when caring for others becomes a way of justifying one's own existence. Loving becomes a way of being needed, not of being chosen. Over time, this pattern takes its toll: emotional fatigue, silent resentment, and a sense of always giving beyond the limit. Emotional healing begins when the person realizes that empathy does not require constant sacrifice, and that learning to receive is as important as knowing how to give, an essential step before facing the guilt that settled back there, still in childhood. When love is lacking, the child needs to find an explanation. And almost always she concludes that it is her fault. This internalized guilt works as an attempt to maintain some control. If I'm the problem, maybe I can fix it. This is how self-abandonment is born. The child stops protecting himself, listening to himself, and starts to take responsibility for the emotional neglect he experienced. In adult life, this guilt appears as constant self-criticism, difficulty recognizing needs, and a tendency to always put oneself in the background. The person feels ashamed of needing, afraid of bothering, and discomfort when receiving care. Self-worth is conditioned by how much he can handle alone, reinforcing self-sufficiency as an emotional rule. The cruelest thing is that this pattern looks like maturity, when in fact it is ancient survival. Rejection no longer needs to come from outside, because the person rejects himself first. Breaking this cycle does not require new guilt, but awareness. And this recognition makes room for something transformative to stop abandoning yourself and start, little by little, to choose yourself. Emotional healing does not happen because someone explains their trauma, but because the body lives different experiences than it has lived before. The secure attachment gained is born when the nervous system begins to perceive constancy, predictability, and care even if it may seem strange at first. For those who grew up with emotional abandon, security may sound boring, but that's precisely where the healing begins. This relearning goes through simple and repeated practices. Creating routines, keeping small commitments with yourself, learning to pause before reacting, all of this strengthens self-regulation. Secure relationships also help, but the first bond to be rebuilt is internal. Books like Attached, by Amir Levine, or Love and Respect for Yourself, by Nathaniel Branden, help to reorganize internal maps of attachment and self-worth. The central point is to understand that security is not the absence of conflict, it is the presence of repair. The invisible trauma begins to lose strength when the body learns that mistakes do not automatically lead to rejection. Gradually, vigilance gives way to trust, and survival makes room for something new, the real possibility of belonging, including oneself. Healing is not erasing the past, it is stopping living from it. Identity rewriting happens when the person realizes that many of their traits are not who they are, but adaptations to emotional abandonment. Hypervigilance, extreme self-sufficiency, self-sabotage, all of these were survival maps. Useful one day, limiting now. Returning to the internal home means building, on the inside, the environment that was missing on the outside. It is learning to treat each other with predictability, respect, and care, even on bad days. Small rituals help: talking to yourself more kindly, setting clear boundaries, choosing relationships that don't constantly activate rejection. Self-worth is no longer something to be proven and becomes something to be recognized. At this point, something quietly changes. The adult who emerges begins to offer the inner child what he never had: presence, listening, and protection. The secure attachment gain is not emotional perfection, it is coherence. And when the internal maps change, the external world responds differently, because now what guides life is no longer the invisible trauma, but the security built step by step. After understanding all this, there is a question impossible to ignore: how many of your choices were made out of love and how many were made out of fear? Fear of rejection, emotional abandonment, needing too much and ending up alone again. Recognizing these patterns isn't about blaming the past, it's about realizing that you no longer need to live on the automatic of survival. Maybe today you can see where self-sabotage appears, how hypervigilance steals your peace, or how self-sufficiency has become too heavy a shield to carry. From here, the invitation is simple and profound: start small. A limit respected, a request for help made, a moment of self-regulation before reacting. This is how the nervous system learns that there is now choice, not just repetition. What if you could, little by little, become the safe adult that child needed? Build self-worth without having to prove anything, experience bonds without living waiting for the end, transform invisible trauma into awareness and emotional healing. The secure attachment conquered is not born of great promises, but of daily decisions not to abandon oneself anymore. If this content made sense to you, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Here we continue to talk about attachment, emotional abandonment, healing, and internal reconstruction without romanticizing pain, but also without underestimating its capacity for transformation.